They say the woods go silent before something finds you. But that night, the silence didn't protect us. It warned us. The air felt heavier with every breath, and somewhere beyond the campfire's glow, the dark began to whisper my name. The shadows didn't move with the firelight anymore. They moved with me. Tonight, Dreadscribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. The first night in the Pines was supposed to be quiet. That's why I came, miles away from the static of phone towers, far from the city's hum, to let the silence stitch my thoughts back together. But the silence here wasn't absence, it was density. It pressed against my ears like deep water, the kind of quiet that holds its breath and listens. When the whispers began, I thought it was the wind. The pines shivered in long rolling sighs, their needles rattling like distant applause. But as the night thickened, the sound began to bend, rhythmic, deliberate, almost conversational. I froze by the dying fire, certain I'd imagined it until I heard it again, faint, layered, and unmistakably human. Words, or something that wanted to be words, braided into the wind. I told myself it was pareidolia, the mind's hunger for patterns. I'm a sound engineer by trade. I know the brain can find music in static, faces in bark, meaning in noise. But this was different. When I leaned closer, the whispers rose, fragile as radio interference. They repeated a phrase that turned my stomach cold. You shouldn't have come. The flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam slicing through drifting mist. I scanned the trees. Nothing moved except their slow breathing sway. The air tasted metallic, sharp, like rain before a storm. I tried to laugh, to anchor myself in logic. Wind through hollow trunks can create resonance tones, I reminded myself. Low-frequency vibrations, the kind you feel more than hear, can make you anxious, dizzy, even afraid. Scientists call it infrasound. It's known to cause nausea, nightmares, that creeping sense of being watched. I repeated the term like a charm against superstition. But then something stranger happened. The whispers changed. They began echoing my own words, things I'd said hours ago while setting up camp. Check the tent poles, one hissed. Light the fire, another murmured from behind me. I turned in circles, the flashlight stuttering against the mist. The forest was mimicking me. My own voice came back in fragments, distorted by distance and time. I pressed record on my field mic, heart hammering. If this was sound reflection, I'd capture it. But the longer I listened, the less it felt like reflection and more like rehearsal. The forest wasn't replaying me. It was learning me. Each repetition sharpened, syllables aligning until the mimicry was perfect. My own tone, my own hesitation, my own breath between words. I wanted to leave, but curiosity chained me there. I adjusted the mic gain, scanning for the origin point. The decibel levels spiked below 20 hertz, beyond human hearing. Exactly where infrasound lives. But the waveform wasn't random. It pulsed in intervals, patterns of 3 like Morse code. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. As if something beneath the soil was signaling. The fire hissed as if offended. My skin prickled. A gust swept through, carrying a sound so deep it trembled through my ribs. And for the briefest second, I thought the forest exhaled my name. And that's when the realization hit me like a falling tree. What if I wasn't just hearing the forest? What if the forest was listening back? I barely slept after that. The whispers had retreated before dawn, leaving the woods as still as a cathedral. But the silence no longer felt neutral. It was watchful. When sunlight finally spilled across the clearing, the trees looked different, their trunks bent ever so slightly inward, as though conferring over me. My recording device lay on the ground where I'd dropped it. The screen showed a waveform unlike anything I'd seen. Low, undulating peaks like the slow heartbeat of some buried animal. I played it back, expecting random noise. Instead, my own voice spilled out, an exact replica of what I'd said hours before. But layered beneath it was another frequency, faint but deliberate, like a bass line under a melody. Slowing it down revealed a shape to the sound. Not language, but code, a pattern of intervals too precise to be wind. It reminded me of how whales call across oceans, or how seismic stations detect tremors thousands of miles away. The forest wasn't echoing. It was transmitting. All at once I felt like a bug pinned to glass. The pines around me rose impossibly tall, swaying like green lungs inhaling a secret. Needles hissed in a rhythm that almost matched the pulse on my recorder. My breath grew shallow. If infrasound could cause fear, what else could it do? Could it prime memory, implant suggestions, manipulate thought itself? I tried to focus, but my hands shook so hard the device rattled like a warning. I decided to leave. Packing my gear felt like gathering a crime scene. As I zipped the tent, I heard it again. The whisper, soft as ash, falling. This time it wasn't random fragments. It said, "Don't go." My stomach turned. I spun toward the trees, scanning for movement, but there was only the tremor of shadows. The mist thickened into pale ribbons, wrapping between trunks like strands of silk. Each gust of wind felt like a hand brushing past my ear. I forced myself down the trail, heart thudding against my ribs like fists on a locked door. But the farther I walked, the less the trail resembled itself. Landmarks I'd memorized, fallen logs, a boulder shaped like a sleeping dog, had shifted or vanished. It was as if the forest was folding in on itself, restitching the path behind me. And always, under the hush of pine needles, came the low pulse from my recording, steady as a metronome, now matching the pace of my heart. At the ridge, I stopped and turned on the recorder one last time. The waveform danced across the screen. The pulse had changed again, becoming a slow, deliberate cadence of 3. Pause, 3, pause, like breathing. Or waiting. The wind rose in a single cavernous sigh that rattled my bones. And then, from every direction at once, the forest exhaled in my own voice. "Where will you run?" I froze, caught between the path ahead and the pines behind. The air itself seemed to vibrate as if expecting an answer. I stepped into hollow running was exact. It felt less like walking into a valley and more like stepping inside a breath that had been held too long. The air was dense, almost metallic, and the earth carried a subtle vibration that traveled up through my boots. I was there with 2 geologists, Dr. Harlan, who still believed everything had a logical explanation, and May, who believed logic was simply what we hadn't learned to fear yet. The creek bed stretched ahead like a scar, dry, colorless, lifeless, but locals said it moved, that it swallowed hikers whole. We brought ground-penetrating radar and seismic sensors, convinced the stories were myth. The data would, we hoped, prove the land's instability, underground pockets of gas, maybe a collapsed cavern system. The readings came back strange. Each ping returned an echo deeper than the last, a pattern no instrument could trace to its end. Harlan frowned, muttering about false reflections, but May leaned down, pressing her ear to the soil as though listening to a secret. She whispered that it sounded hollow, like tapping the surface of a drum. We began a grid scan. Each footstep set off faint tremors beneath us, subtle at first, then rhythmic. I thought it might be coincidence until I realized the pulses had a tempo. Steady, deliberate, organic. The sensation wasn't random. It was alive. When I knelt to adjust the sensor, the Earth's rhythm aligned with my own heartbeat, then overtook it. The feeling was intoxicating and terrifying, like standing on the chest of something sleeping and knowing it might wake. By dusk, the air turned colder. The ground exhaled a breath of mist that coiled upward through cracks in the stone. It moved in slow spirals, too thick for mere condensation, and smelled faintly of rust and ozone. Harlan suggested it was trapped moisture reacting to the dropping temperature, but even he couldn't explain the way the rocks seemed to shift beneath our lamps. Subtle, almost imperceptible rearrangements, as if the terrain itself was inhaling. May recorded audio samples, noting frequencies too low for human hearing. Infrasound, she said quietly, the kind produced by volcanic chambers or massive geological voids. But there were no volcanoes for hundreds of miles. The data log showed the tremors repeating in perfect intervals, 5 seconds apart. Then 4, then 3. The pulse was speeding up. The mist thickened, curling around our ankles like smoke from an unseen fire. The air pressure dropped. My ears popped. The temperature plunged 10 degrees in seconds, and every instinct screamed to leave. But the ground beneath us felt strangely magnetic, as though it didn't want to let go. May pointed at the monitor. Our seismic map flickered with new readings. They weren't random vibrations anymore. They formed waves, almost symmetrical, radiating outward like ripples in water. I stared at the data, frozen. Ripples only form when something moves first. The realization came like ice through my spine. This wasn't the earth shifting beneath us. It was something inside the earth, something deep, slow, and deliberate, moving beneath itself. And then the ground inhaled. The ground's inhale was subtle at first, like the faint suction before a tide. Pebbles rolled inward. The dust at our feet spun into tiny vortices that died as quickly as they formed. May's flashlight beam trembled as the air thickened, bending the light like water. The sound that followed wasn't thunder. It was deeper, an infrasonic moan that pressed against my chest and skull until I thought my bones might hum apart. We were no longer studying the ground. We were standing on the skin of something vast enough to breathe. Harlan shouted for us to back away, but his voice came out thin and warped. The mist had become dense enough to taste, mineral, ancient, metallic. My ears rang, and I realized the infrasound was interfering with my balance. Every instinct said run, but the Earth's pull was magnetic, holding us in place like prey caught in the gravity of a larger body. When I stumbled forward, the vibration beneath me intensified, matching the rhythm of my steps. It was responding to us. May knelt again, trembling, her hand pressed flat against the soil. Her eyes darted to me wide and disbelieving. "It's not a void," she whispered. "It's a chamber, organic resonance." The words barely reached me, swallowed by the growing hum. Our instruments were useless, screens flickering with indecipherable waves. But in that static chaos, I caught something repeating, a pattern embedded in the noise. Not random seismic noise, heartbeat intervals. The creek bed pulsed beneath us, like the slow throb of an artery buried under centuries of stone. The heartbeat grew stronger, syncopated, steady. I dropped to one knee, placing my palm on the cold rock. It was warmer than it should have been. Every pulse radiated heat, as though the ground was exhaling through layers of earth. The temperature gauge on my wrist began to climb. 42 degrees Celsius, then 44. Something beneath was alive and waking up. The moment it shifted, the world bent. The rocks shuddered outward, soil splitting into symmetrical cracks that pulsed with faint blue light, veins in a sleeping giant. The mist erupted upward, screaming through fissures like steam from a ruptured lung. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, thrumming through marrow, a low frequency too ancient for language. May screamed for Harlan, but his silhouette vanished behind the vapor. One moment he was there, the next gone, as if the ground had swallowed him whole. I ran toward the ridge, lungs burning. Behind me, the mist rolled like surf, devouring the creek bed in folds of white and shadow. The heartbeat slowed again, settling into a lullaby rhythm, patient and deliberate. It wasn't chasing, it was resetting. At the ridge, I turned back and saw the terrain flatten, the cracks sealing as though nothing had ever happened. The mist dissipated, leaving silence so complete it rang. May stood beside me, trembling, staring at the void where Harlan had been. "It sleeps," she murmured, voice hollow. I looked at the ground, the soil still faintly pulsing beneath my boots. Something beneath us wasn't dead, it was dreaming. The lake was so still that night it looked like a mirror pressed against the world. Not the kind of mirror that shows you who you are, but the kind that shows you who's watching. I had set up camp on its northern edge, miles from any trail, chasing quiet after too many restless months buried in city noise. The air was cool, touched with pine and iron. Even the stars looked subdued, their reflections trembling across the glassy surface like thoughts I hadn't yet dared to have. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sound that didn't belong there. A splash, quick, deliberate, near the shore. I thought maybe a deer had wandered close, or a fish had leapt. But when I stepped out of my tent, the lake had gone still again. Completely still. And there, at the edge of the water, was my reflection. Only I wasn't standing near the shore. I was 20 feet away from it, barefoot in the cold grass, breath fogging in the night air. Yet my reflection remained upright at the lake's edge, staring back. For a long moment, I convinced myself it was an illusion, a trick of depth, a distortion from the fog rolling in from the opposite bank. I raised my hand. The reflection followed, slightly slower. Not enough to notice if you weren't looking for it, but enough to make the hair on my arms rise. My pulse quickened. The reflection tilted its head in perfect delay, as though trying to synchronize but never quite catching up. The lake gave another soft splash. This time I saw it. the faint ripple radiating out from where my reflection's foot should have been. It wasn't me moving, it was the image itself. I stumbled backward, my heel catching a root, and hit the ground hard. The reflection froze mid-motion, as if surprised by my reaction. Then without a sound, it lowered its head until its face vanished beneath the water. The ripple spread outward, distorting the stars into broken shards of light. I don't remember running back to the tent, but I remember zipping it closed, heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo through the fabric. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching my flashlight like a weapon against the silence. The next morning, I found animal tracks in the damp soil near the lake. They weren't deer. They were human-shaped, but too narrow, too long. They led out of the lake, looping around my tent in a perfect circle, and disappeared back into the water. I told myself I must have imagined it. Sleep deprivation does strange things, especially near large bodies of still water. Scientists have documented something called acoustic mirroring, where low-frequency sounds reflect in ways that can distort perception. But when I played back my audio recorder from the night before, something else came through the static, my own voice, whispering words I never said, and beneath it, faint but deliberate, came a second echo, a voice that sounded almost like mine. The sky hung low over the lake, a slab of gray that made the water look like poured lead. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being measured, watched not by eyes, but by something older, something patient. My recorder sat on my lap like a captured insect. Every time I pressed play, that faint second echo came through again, its delay only a fraction of a second behind mine, like a shadow tripping over its own feet. But now, slowed down, it sounded almost curious, as if it were testing my words, rolling them across an unseen tongue. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself the reflection had been fog, the tracks and animals, the echo an artifact of air temperature and sound bouncing off the water. But when dusk bled across the pines, my resolve began to crack. The lake became glass again, blacker than oil, swallowing the sky. My tent sat at the center of that strange circle of tracks, like a ritual I hadn't agreed to participate in. The stillness wasn't peace anymore. It was the silence of something holding its breath. I recorded a new test. Speaking slowly, I said my name, then waited. The echo came back delayed, distorted, like someone mimicking me through water. I tried again with a sentence I'd never spoken before. Nonsense words, shapes of sound. The echo repeated them, each one a little clearer than the last, as if it were learning. The hairs on my neck lifted. My reflection on the lake's surface tilted its head a moment after I did, a marionette tethered to invisible strings. Then the splashing started again. Not random, but deliberate. 3 splashes. Pause. 3 splashes. My pulse quickened. The mist rolled across the lake, thicker this time, curling over the water's skin like fingers. My reflection raised its arm. Only this time it didn't mirror me. It beckoned. I stepped backward, but the echo on the recorder whispered forward. Not delayed now, perfectly synchronized. Come here, it said, my voice but stripped of warmth, a flat intonation like sonar pinging through a cave. I snapped the recorder shut and stumbled toward the tree line. The air felt electric, buzzing against my skin. Behind me, the lake's surface convulsed once, twice. Then my reflection stepped out of the water. The splash was soft, but the sound carried like a stone dropped into a well. It didn't walk toward me. It simply stood, dripping with a darkness that wasn't water, head tilted as though waiting for me to choose. The recorder in my hand vibrated, then clicked itself on, capturing a faint rising sound that wasn't wind or waves. I held my breath. The echo spoke again, no longer delayed, an exact replica of my inner thought before I had even formed it into words. Then it started answering my thoughts. I'd hiked the same ridge a dozen times before. Every twist, every fallen log, every bend in the stream was muscle memory by now, a landscape etched into my mind like a map carved in light. But the morning I returned, the trail greeted me as a stranger. The forest smelled the same, that damp perfume of pine and soil, yet something beneath it felt rearranged. The air was thicker, the light sharper. It was as if the forest had shifted a few inches to the left overnight. My GPS refused to cooperate. The digital arrow spun in lazy circles no matter which direction I walked. I chalked it up to poor signal or magnetic interference, common enough in dense terrain. But the longer I trekked, the more the forest seemed to contradict itself. A grove that should have opened into meadow now funneled into darker timber. The sound of the river moved, first ahead of me, then behind. Even the birds were silent, as though sound itself was cautious. By the second hour, I began marking trees with chalk to ensure I wasn't looping back. But when I returned to what should have been my first mark, the bark was clean, the chalk erased. Only the faint impression of pressure remained, like something had rubbed it away deliberately. I stopped and turned a slow circle. The forest didn't move, not exactly, but it seemed to breathe. The trees leaned just slightly, their trunks curved inward as though listening. The compass was next to fail. The needle jittered, then swung decisively, not north but toward a single point in the woods to my right. It stayed there, vibrating as if caught in the gravity of something unseen. Against all logic, I followed it. Curiosity has always been my fatal flaw. The ground sloped gently downward into a clearing I didn't remember. A smooth hollow framed by roots and ferns, the air dense enough to taste. At the center stood a small wooden signpost. It looked hand-carved, rough and recent. I'd walked this trail countless times and had never seen it before. My first thought was that it marked a new route added by rangers or locals, but the wood was too raw, the carving too clean, as if it had just been placed there. My compass needle bent toward it completely, trembling. The GPS flickered, briefly showing my location as a perfect circle before freezing. When I stepped closer, my breath caught. The sign didn't bear a trail name or direction. It bore my name, first and last, etched in neat, deliberate letters. The grooves were fresh, dusted with pale curls of wood shavings at the base. For a moment I stood frozen, trying to rationalize what couldn't be true. Maybe a prank. But by whom? There wasn't another hiker within miles. The air thickened until it felt like walking through memory. My hand hovered near the sign, and the compass needle spasmed violently, bending until it snapped. A low hum rose from the ground, subtle, pulsing, rhythmic. I blinked, dizzy, and stepped back instinctively. When I looked again, the sign had changed, and this time it didn't say my name. The new carving was shallower, jagged, as if done in haste. 3 words replaced my name. Turn back now. The edges of the letters bled sap that glistened like tears. My throat went dry. I stepped backward, expecting the forest to reclaim the sign again. But it held, steady and unblinking. Every instinct told me to run, yet something in that warning, so deliberate, so human, felt less like threat and more like mercy. I turned to leave, retracing my steps toward where the ridge should have been. But the path dissolved into an unfamiliar slope. My boots sank into soil that was too soft, too recent, as though the earth had been turned over freshly. Trees shifted in quiet choreography, trunks aligning to form a narrow corridor I didn't remember crossing before. The air was darker now, heavy with the metallic scent of rain, though the sky was clear. Somewhere in the distance I heard what sounded like a heartbeat, slow, patient, coming from the ground. I took a step, then another. My compass dangled uselessly from its broken neck, the needle twitching in spasms like a dying insect. My GPS glowed weakly in my pocket, displaying the same circular pattern it had shown before. But this time, the circle was smaller. It was shrinking, each second pulling tighter around a single blinking point. Panic began to rise, hot and bitter. I started marking trees again, carving small notches with my knife. The forest retaliated. When I turned around minutes later, the cuts were gone, the bark smooth and whole, as if healing faster than I could make a mark. Even the footprints I'd left in the soil had vanished. It was like walking on a living organism that refused to be mapped. I called out, once, twice, my voice bouncing oddly, echoing back not from the direction I faced, but from behind me. It wasn't a normal echo either. It carried words I hadn't spoken yet. I froze as the echo whispered faintly, "Don't look back." For the first time, I realized how wrong the air felt. It wasn't wind moving through the branches. It was breath, shallow and measured. The forest wasn't a maze. It was a chest cavity, expanding and contracting, the trees its ribs. I was walking inside something vast and ancient, something that didn't like to be seen. Then I saw it again. The signpost. Only now it stood 20 feet ahead, though I'd been walking away from it. The words had changed once more. "You're inside." I staggered back, eyes darting for any direction that still made sense. But the terrain folded in on itself. trails splitting and looping like veins. My GPS died. The forest pulsed once, deeply, and the hum I'd felt before became a vibration that traveled straight through my bones. I looked one final time at the sign. The letters rearranged, lines shifting like liquid under the wood surface. Now it said my name again, only this time it was carved with tomorrow's cabin, or when it found me. The forest trail had thinned into silence, that heavy kind of stillness that seems to swallow sound rather than hold it. My legs ached from hours of walking. My phone battery pulsed at 5%, and the temperature had been dropping fast. But when I stepped into the clearing, the air suddenly warmed. Not gently, not gradually, instantly, like crossing an invisible threshold into a different season. The cabin stood there, hunched beneath a canopy of leaning pines. No smoke rose from its chimney, no lantern burned behind its windows, yet the space around it glowed faintly gold, as if the air itself remembered fire. The warmth was unsettling, dry, stale, the way air feels when it's been trapped for too long. My first thought was geothermal activity, maybe a vent or mineral pocket beneath the soil, but there were no signs of that. Just the cabin, the quiet, and the strange pulse of heat that seemed to breathe in rhythm with my own heart. The door was unlatched. It creaked open at a touch. Inside the cabin was a museum of abandonment. A table stood neatly set for four, plates rimmed with dust so thick they looked carved from stone. A kettle rested on a cold iron stove, its spout stained with the memory of steam. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like forgotten curtains. It felt staged, not lived in, but prepared. Like whoever left had done so mid-performance, expecting to return before the applause faded. I ran my gloved hand across the table. Beneath the dust, the wood was warm. That stopped me. The hearth was empty, yet the temperature inside was higher than outside. No insulation, no electricity, no visible source. I pulled out my thermal camera, a habit from documenting strange phenomena for years. Through the lens, the cabin glowed faintly along the walls, as if a gentle pulse moved within them. But what froze me was what lay in the center of the room. 5 distinct heat signatures, faint but human-shaped, standing around the table like ghosts of memory. There was no one there. The room was empty, yet the thermal display disagreed. I turned slowly, watching as one of the signatures flickered and vanished, only to reappear closer, right beside where I stood. The lens blurred, the feed distorted, and the warm air pressed tighter around my chest. I backed away, heart drumming. My breath came out visible despite the heat. I fled into the forest. The temperature dropped immediately, the cold biting into my skin like truth returning after a lie. My watch said I'd walked less than 2 minutes when I found myself back in the same clearing. Same trees, same slant of fading light. And there it was, the cabin again, identical in every detail. The same broken shutter, the same kettle, the same door slightly ajar, as if waiting for me to finish what I'd started. And when I looked through the thermal lens this time, there were 6 heat signatures inside. I froze at the edge of the clearing, my boots sinking into the soft mulch of pine needles. The screen of the thermal camera pulsed faintly, the 6th signature flickering in and out like a heartbeat losing rhythm. My first instinct was to believe it was a glitch, battery interference, residual heat, anything. But the shapes on the display were too precise. 5 clustered near the table, 1 stationed at the doorway, exactly where I stood. The warmth outside the cabin felt heavier now, thicker, as if the air were syrup. I tried to retreat, but the ground beneath my feet felt subtly different, springier, softer, like a carpet laid over something hollow. Each step away from the cabin led me only deeper into the glow until I realized I wasn't walking out of the clearing at all. The tree line had drawn closer, the shadows crowding in like a silent audience. I turned back. The cabin had shifted, or maybe the world had. Its roofline tilted slightly, the window frames narrower, like a sketch being redrawn between blinks. I raised the camera again. The 6th signature had moved. It now stood in the doorway, my own outline, my own size. But no matter how hard I stared, I saw only empty air. My breath caught in my throat as the cabin door swung open with a soundless invitation. The heat signatures inside turned as one toward the entrance, their forms smudging like wet ink. I stepped forward without meaning to, compelled by some strange gravity. Inside, the air was warmer still, heavy with the smell of old wood and faint iron. Dust swirled lazily, yet the plates on the table were clean now. the cutlery arranged as if expecting guests at any moment. The kettle on the stove rattled once, though no flame burned beneath it. Every detail had been reset except for one thing: a single chair at the table pulled out, waiting. My heart thudded like a muffled drum. I lifted the camera again. All 6 signatures had converged around the chair, their heat pulsing faintly through the walls. Then one signature peeled away and moved directly behind me. I spun, but nothing was there. Only a ripple in the dust, the faint impression of footsteps pressed into the floorboards where no weight should be. I dropped the camera and stumbled outside. The cabin stayed behind me, but its warmth clung to my skin like static. The sky above the clearing was a dull gray now, no stars visible, though it had been bright only minutes before. Time felt as if it had collapsed, folded into a loop like paper creased until the edges met. I reached for the camera again, desperate for proof. The screen flickered, the battery icon empty. Only one signature remained visible now, seated at the table, perfectly still. I tilted the lens downward, expecting to see my own glow, but there was nothing. No heat, no outline. By morning, my own body wasn't showing up on the thermal lens. The valley was a mouth, and that night, it learned how to scream. I'd come to the highlands with Ethan, a colleague from the acoustics lab, to record wind harmonics in the narrow pass where the cliffs carved sound into song. We were chasing aeolian tones, those ghostly, flute-like whispers that form when air brushes against rock. Scientists study them for their patterns, their resonance, the way the earth hums quietly to itself. But what I heard that night didn't sound like the earth. It sounded like something inside it was trying to speak. At first, it was beautiful. The wind moved through the ravine in steady waves, rich and melodic. My instruments captured perfect data, frequencies clean enough to graph into elegant curves. But then the tone shifted, low and mournful, like breath pressed through a throat that wasn't quite human. I felt it before I heard it, the vibration crawling through the ground and into my legs, a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. Ethan laughed, said it was just resonance, but I saw his hands tremble as he adjusted the mic. The pitch grew sharper. The air seemed to tighten around us. I raised my recorder toward the darkness, watching the sound waves dance across the monitor in perfect symmetry. Then, in an instant, they fractured. The graph rippled, distorted, and something new appeared, an anomaly hidden between the frequencies. It wasn't random noise. It was structured, patterned, intentional. When we slowed it down, it formed phonemes, human speech sounds, faint but unmistakable. Ethan thought it was interference. I thought it was impossible, yet the shapes on the spectrogram aligned too cleanly. Vowels and consonants stitched together into one word. Run. The wind surged suddenly, howling through the gorge like a choir of broken voices. Our tent buckled. Loose gravel skittered uphill against gravity. I tried to rationalize it. Vortex shedding, pressure waves, anything. But the sound pressed deeper, vibrating through my chest until my teeth ached. The word came again, buried beneath the shriek. Run. I stumbled outside, the night slicing at my face with icy air. The stars above spun wildly, smudged by the wind's frenzy. It didn't roar like weather anymore. It keened, a sound too focused, too articulate. I shouted for Ethan, but my voice disappeared inside the gale. The sound didn't carry, it was absorbed. Like the wind was listening. We stayed awake until it finally died down. By dawn, the valley was silent again, the world deceptively normal. But the air felt scarred somehow, as though sound itself had left fingerprints behind. I checked the recordings, hours of static, except for one 2-minute clip. The waveform trembled like a pulse. When I played it back, I heard that voice again, whispering through layers of noise. It wasn't warning us anymore. It was calling, and when I ran the clip through a reverse spectrogram, the phonemes rearranged themselves, slow, deliberate. I stared at the screen, and chillingly clear flickered across the spectrogram like handwriting scrawled in static. It felt impossible, a coincidence built of noise and nerves, but the shape of each phoneme was too deliberate. It was me. I whispered my own name aloud as if testing a mirror, and the recorder's waveform trembled back at me in perfect echo. A warning, a taunt, or something else entirely. When I stepped out of the tent, dawn was a pale bruise over the mountains. The valley lay silent, yet my ears rang as if the wind still screamed. Ethan's tent sagged under a thin frost, the kind that paints everything silver like memory. I called for him, expecting his familiar groggy reply. Nothing. I opened the flap. His sleeping bag was there, his boots gone. The tent walls had been slashed, not torn outward, not dragged inward, but sliced cleanly, like fabric under a scalpel. I searched for tracks, any sign of where he'd gone. The ground was bare except for a thin dusting of pebbles arranged in a strange arc leading to the edge of the gorge. They didn't look placed by wind. They looked arranged, coded like a forgotten map. The hair on my arms stood upright. It wasn't just absence that chilled me. It was precision. Something had designed this silence. Desperate, I turned back to my equipment. The recorder still ran, its red light pulsing like a heartbeat. I played the clip again, slowed further. Underneath the main whisper of my name, new syllables emerged, fragmented, broken, like a second voice learning language. The pitch wavered with each attempt. It was as though the valley was rehearsing how to speak to me. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed to pack up and run. But my hands moved automatically, checking data, scanning for hidden frequencies. The scientist in me clawed for a rational foothold, but the human in me felt something older, deeper, an intelligence buried in the air. Nature as a sentient warning system, using resonance to shape thought, bending sound until it resembled speech. The wind rose again. Not a gale this time, but a low, steady exhale from the gorge. My name drifted through it, softer now, almost coaxing. I stepped backward, and the pitch dropped, following me like a tether. Pebbles rattled at my feet, rolling uphill toward the sound. The gorge seemed to expand, the cliffs bending inward like jaws closing. I grabbed the recorder and bolted up the slope, lungs burning, the wind clutching at my coat. Behind me, the exhale deepened into a moan, long, mournful, but shaped. The spectrogram in my mind drew itself even before I hit record. 3 syllables, then pause, 3 syllables, pause. It was calling, and it was waiting for an answer. At the ridge, I finally dared to play the last clip back. The valley's voice had changed. No longer whispering run, no longer even whispering my name. It was saying, clear and unbroken, where are you going? There's a strange comfort in a campfire's glow, the illusion that light alone can hold back everything waiting in the dark. That night, the forest was so still it felt like we'd been placed there, suspended in some quiet pocket of the world. The fire cracked in slow rhythm, throwing orange veins of light across our faces. There were 4 of us, rangers, scientists, wanderers who'd seen too many miles of wilderness, and yet the silence between stories stretched longer than usual. Maybe it was the way the air felt wrong, thicker, watching. To fill the quiet, Ben started talking about local legends. He said the old loggers spoke of something called the flicker, a shadow that only appears in light, something that mimics you perfectly until the moment you turn your back. Supposedly it feeds not on people but on the memory of them. The fire popped sharply at that word, memory, and for a moment all of us laughed it off. Folklore, we said. Heat, smoke, and too much whiskey can make anything seem alive. But later, as the flames settled lower, I noticed something odd. The fire wasn't dancing outward, it was bending inward, as though something in the center was pulling it closer. The air rippled above it like heat over asphalt, and our shadows stretched long across the ground. Too long, I raised my hand. My shadow hesitated a second before following. I thought it was exhaustion until Ben swore under his breath and pointed. His shadow's arm was still raised, frozen in midair while his own hand was down. We laughed again, but the sound didn't fit the moment. It fell flat, swallowed before it reached the trees. The forest didn't echo anymore, it listened. One by one, the others noticed. Our silhouettes wavered against the dirt like reflections on disturbed water, each movement delayed by a fraction of a heartbeat. I told myself it was the firelight playing tricks, an optical illusion caused by uneven flames. But then the shadows began to move on their own, the shapes twisted, elongating just beyond the circle of light, their limbs bending where ours didn't. When one of the flames hissed and went out, something darker slipped between us. The smoke didn't rise, it sank, folding into the ground. The fire flared again as if gasping for air, and for an instant, I saw more shadows than people. The fire's heat turned strange, cold at the edges, feverish at the core. I leaned closer, trying to understand why it pulsed like a living heart. Within the coals, faint after-images shimmered. our own movements from minutes earlier, playing back like echoes in light. The fire wasn't just reflecting us anymore. It was remembering us, recording us. No one spoke after that. We just sat, caught between curiosity and terror, watching the flames bend inward as if trying to reclaim something it had already taken. By dawn, when the last ember died, I counted our shadows against the light. There were only 3. We stood frozen, staring at the dirt where Ben's shadow should have been. The early morning light had crawled through the trees, pale and thin, but even the sun couldn't bring warmth. 3 silhouettes stretched across the campsite, mine, Claire's, and Rowan's, but the ground where Ben stood was blank. No outline, no trace, just empty soil that reflected nothing back. He kept insisting it had to be the angle of the light. He turned in circles, waved his arms, stomped his feet, desperate to cast something onto the earth. Nothing. The rest of us pretended to help him find it, but deep down we knew. The fire had taken something, and whatever had gone missing wasn't coming back with daylight. We packed in silence. The air still carried that strange warmth, not from the sun, but from the ground itself. When I kicked dirt over the fire pit, heat surged up like breath through teeth. Beneath the ash, the coals glowed faintly, not red, but white, as though light had been compressed until it couldn't escape. My stomach turned. Fire doesn't stay warm that long without fuel, unless it was still burning something. We left the clearing, but the forest didn't feel like the same place. Each step made the air shimmer faintly, as if the sunlight had been bent into invisible waves. I kept seeing flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, thin silhouettes darting between trees, echoing our own steps. When I stopped, the forest stopped too. Even the birds were gone. Claire whispered that her shadow looked wrong. I turned to her and she was right. It lagged half a second behind her movements, like a delayed reflection in dark water. Rowan's did the same. Mine too. The realization spread between us slowly, cold as fog. Whatever had taken Ben's shadow wasn't finished. It was learning us one by one. We picked up the pace, following the narrow ridge trail toward the ranger station. But with each turn, the sun dimmed, fading behind a haze that shouldn't have been there. By the time we reached the clearing, daylight had lost its sharpness entirely. Everything glowed faintly amber, the same hue as firelight. I turned back once and saw our shadows stretching long across the ground again, longer than physics should have allowed. They bent toward the forest, pulling slightly, as though yearning to go home. When we finally reached the cabin, Ben wasn't behind us anymore. His pack lay on the trail, his footprints ending mid-stride. The ground beneath them was warm. I lifted my camera out of instinct and snapped a photo. The screen showed 4 people standing there, 4 perfect silhouettes against the tree line. The 4th one was Ben. That night, after we barricaded the doors, the light from the fireplace began to flicker strangely, bending inward once more. The air shimmered and the warmth felt familiar, too familiar. I looked down at my feet and saw my shadow sway slightly, even though I wasn't moving. And when the fire whispered, its crackle formed a word that chilled me to my core. Saw him, a lone park ranger standing just beyond the glow of my campfire. The trees behind him were ink black, their outlines erased by mist, yet his figure looked sharp, defined, almost luminous against the dark. He carried a flashlight but didn't use it. The beam hung motionless, aimed at the ground, a single coin of white light. I remember thinking how strange it was that I hadn't heard his approach. No crunch of leaves, no footsteps, just silence followed by his voice. He asked if I'd heard the calls. His tone was even, official, but something in the phrasing unsettled me. "The calls?" I said I hadn't heard anything. He nodded once, almost relieved, then adjusted the radio clip to his vest. The static that poured out wasn't the usual white noise. It had rhythm, a pulse, like breathing through broken speakers. Between the crackles, I caught fragments of words. Open perimeter, containment breach, east sector unsecure. I thought it was some kind of drill. Rangers run emergency protocols all the time. But there was something wrong about the way he stood, like the sound wasn't coming from the radio, but from him. He said the area was closed, that I'd need to pack up and leave by dawn. When I asked his name, he hesitated, then said, "Ranger Marin." I made a note of it in my logbook, habit for documentation. He told me to stay in my tent, then turned and walked into the fog. His flashlight beam drifted upward like a falling star in reverse until it disappeared entirely. I didn't sleep much. Every gust of wind sounded like static. Every creak of pine branches carried a whisper that wasn't wind at all. I kept telling myself it was exhaustion, that the mind invents patterns in noise the way the eye sees faces in clouds. Still, I caught myself glancing toward the tree line every few minutes, waiting for that light to return. By morning, the world looked ordinary again. Blue sky, dew on the grass, the kind of calm that makes you question your own memory. At the ranger station, I told the desk officer about the man I'd met. She frowned, checked the roster, and shook her head. "There's no Marin on staff," she said. I insisted, describing his uniform, his badge, the way his radio had glitched. The officer left briefly and came back holding a laminated sheet, the memorial list for rangers who died in the line of duty. There, near the bottom, was his name. Ranger Thomas Marin, missing 1987. I stared at the photo beside it. Same face, same insignia, same calm expression. The officer asked if I was sure, but I couldn't answer. My throat closed up. For the rest of the day, I walked through the station in a fog, half expecting him to appear again, half praying he wouldn't. That night, back at camp, the forest was silent as stone. I lay in my tent listening to the hum of the crickets fade one by one until even the wind stopped moving. Then his radio started broadcasting again from inside my tent. At first, it was only a low hiss, like water sliding over distant rocks. I told myself it was just the fabric of the tent shifting in the night breeze. But the sound grew clearer, static punctuated by faint, clipped syllables, the same rhythm I'd heard from his radio. My body went rigid. The radio wasn't mine. I didn't even own one. Yet it was here, somewhere inside the thin nylon walls, whispering from the dark. I reached for my flashlight with hands that trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. The beam cut a narrow stripe through the tent, revealing nothing but my sleeping bag and gear. Still, the voice persisted, forming words through the static, each one a little stronger, as though learning how to speak again. Perimeter open. Perimeter open. East sector unsecure. The pitch of the transmission rose and fell in a steady pulse, timed to my heartbeat. Slowly, I traced the sound to my pack. It was coming from the inside, from the bottom pouch where I kept only food and a first aid kit. I unzipped it inch by inch. Nestled among my things was an old Ranger's radio. Olive green, cracked along the edge, its screen dead. It shouldn't have been there. I had never touched it before. Yet it pulsed with a faint amber glow, the color of dying embers. I pressed it to my ear. The static deepened into something lower, wetter, breathing. Between the bursts of noise came words I didn't recognize. Codes, maybe, numbers, fragments of sentences. And then, clear as if someone crouched beside me, his voice. "Stay in the tent. Do not answer the calls." I nearly tore through the zipper in my panic. The night outside was heavy, the trees bending under invisible weight. Moonlight sifted down in broken beams, pooling on the ground like spilled mercury. I spun, scanning for movement, but the forest was empty except for the soft echo of static leaking from the radio. Somewhere beyond the pines, a light flickered. Not a flashlight beam, but a steady orange glow, moving slowly, too far to be a campfire. It swayed like a lantern held by an invisible hand. With each swing, the radio hissed louder, words breaking into sharp commands I couldn't fully understand. My name surfaced once, distorted, stretched like a voice underwater. I backed toward the center of the clearing, clutching the radio like it might explain itself. The glow between the trees grew closer, but no footsteps came with it. My skin prickled. The wind smelled faintly of iron, the same scent from the station's memorial plaque. Then the voice changed. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was urgent, cracking like splintered wood. "Perimeter closed. Do not move." The light stopped at the edge of the clearing, pulsing like a heartbeat. My own reflection stared back from its glow, pale and trembling, as if the night had built a mirror out of air. And from the dead speaker in my hand came one final, deliberate whisper. "I'm already inside." I was halfway through the ridge trail when the forest changed color. Dusk always brings a kind of illusion. Shadows stretching, air turning violet. But this was different. The light itself seemed to rearrange, bending between the trunks in thin vertical threads, pale and precise, like moonlight woven into glass. I thought at first they were hikers with lanterns moving parallel to me through the trees, but their glow was too steady, their formation too exact. No flicker, no footsteps. Just a quiet procession of light moving deeper into the dark. Curiosity overruled sense. I slipped my pack off, crouched, and lifted my binoculars. The glass trembled against my breath. What I saw wasn't light at all, it was shape. Figures, pale as fog, gliding over the ground without touching it. They moved in smooth, deliberate arcs, each carrying something that looked like a cross between a staff and an antenna. The devices spun silently, casting narrow beams of blue-white light that rippled through the air like sonar. Mapping, I thought. They were mapping the forest. But for what? The scientist in me wanted to believe it was explainable. Refraction, drones, projection. Yet there was precision in their movement. Coordination too elegant for random phenomenon. They glided between trees without disturbing a single branch. Every few minutes one would pause, hold up their instrument, and the ground beneath would shimmer faintly, as though responding to some invisible code. I watched in awe, my mind trying to tether what I saw to physics, to reality. But awe quickly became fear when one of the figures turned its head, if it had a head, and looked directly at me. The binoculars slipped from my hands. The forest around me held its breath. I waited for movement, for sound, but the only thing I heard was my pulse roaring in my ears. When I finally lifted the binoculars again, the figures were closer. Much closer. Their pale glow washed faintly across the bark, casting no shadow. I fumbled for my camera, switched it on, dead. The battery had been full an hour ago. My phone wouldn't turn on either. Even my compass needle spun uselessly, trapped in circles. The forest itself seemed magnetized, every atom whispering against the air like static. I backed away slowly, step by careful step. The figures didn't follow, but they didn't disappear either. They simply shifted their attention back to the ground, tracing invisible lines that intersected and branched like veins. I realized with a jolt what the pattern resembled: a map. They weren't wandering aimlessly. They were charting something, measured, deliberate, sacred. When I finally turned to run, the woods erupted in silence, so complete it rang. I stumbled until exhaustion took over, collapsing near a ridge where the stars finally broke through the canopy. My equipment lay useless beside me, drained and heavy. I must have fallen asleep. But when I woke at dawn, my folded map was pinned under my hand. And carved into its surface, etched in thin, perfect lines, was a symbol I didn't recognize. An ancient pattern I later discovered in an old atlas, drawn beside places the cartographers feared to name. It meant symbol until the morning light began to bleed through the canopy. It shimmered faintly, as though the paper itself remembered the glow from the night before. The engraving wasn't random. Its lines were deliberate, etched with geometric precision. I traced it with a trembling finger, concentric arcs surrounding a single point, almost like a compass rose. But instead of cardinal directions, the outer ring was filled with markings, too fluid for numbers, too exact for letters. They looked more like a language drawn from light rather than ink. I tried to tell myself I'd done it, maybe half asleep, hallucinating. Yet the cuts were too clean, as if burned into the fibers from beneath. My first thought was electromagnetic interference, radiation maybe. I needed data, something empirical to cling to. But my instruments were still dead. Camera, phone, even my wristwatch. Their batteries hadn't drained. They'd been erased. Circuits intact, memory gone. I'd seen electromagnetic pulses do strange things in the field, but never this. When I looked back toward the valley, I noticed something I hadn't before. The ground bore faint impressions, elongated oval indentations that ran parallel in looping arcs, leading back into the forest. They weren't footprints exactly. They had no weight. But the moss had thinned where they passed, as though light itself had pressed down. I followed them a few paces before stopping. Every instinct told me to turn around. Curiosity told me to keep going. The air grew colder the deeper I went. The sunlight seemed to dull, losing color as if filtered through fog that wasn't really there. The silence was heavy, thick, alive. And then, faintly, I heard it. A low hum, the same resonance I'd felt the night before. It vibrated in my chest like a second heartbeat. As I moved closer, I saw the forest open into a clearing I didn't remember crossing on the map. There, scattered in the grass, were stones, flat, circular, carved with the same symbol as my map. They formed a rough grid, each one aligned to the next with impossible accuracy. My rational mind spun theories, ancient survey markers, glacial patterns, coincidence. But the moment I stepped closer, the ground flickered. A ripple of pale light spread outward, forming brief outlines, human-shaped silhouettes, before collapsing into nothing. They hadn't left. They were still here. The hum intensified, low and harmonic, like the deep song of the earth itself. My head throbbed. Images flashed behind my eyelids. Maps, stars, fractal geometry, connections between places that shouldn't touch. I understood then what the pattern meant. It wasn't a warning, it was a record, a memory. The Pathfinders weren't mapping the world. They were mapping us. Every step, every breath, every choice, coordinates in a network too vast for comprehension. I stumbled backward, clutching the map as if it were alive. The hum cut out abruptly, leaving the world in a silence so pure it hurt. The light faded. The clearing was empty. That night, when I finally reached the lodge, I tried to sleep. But behind my closed eyes, the same pale lights drifted across the dark like lanterns searching for home. Now I see them even in my dreams. I told myself I was going back for data, not closure. But the truth was simpler and far less scientific. I missed it. The forest, the sound of wind threading through its ribs, the scent of soil that clung like memory. Months had passed since the last expedition, yet the place refused to fade from me. It lingered in dreams, humming faintly in frequencies just below hearing. So when the research team pulled out, I went back alone. The moment my boots touched the boundary trail, the air shifted. It felt like stepping into an echo of myself. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Every footfall, every rustle of fabric carried a tone too deliberate to be coincidence. It wasn't mere resonance. It was response. The forest was listening. The pines swayed in patterns that mimicked my pace, creaking in harmonic rhythm. When I stopped, they stopped too. Somewhere in the distance, a low vibration rippled through the soil, like a whale song carried through wood. I told myself it was the wind, but I didn't believe it. I reached the old site just before dusk, where we'd set up sensors months ago to capture environmental acoustics. Half-buried wires still snaked through the undergrowth, but the equipment was dead, swallowed by moss and time. I dug one out, brushing away dirt, and froze. The casing wasn't corroded. It had grown into the root system, threads of fiber and fungus woven together like circuitry. I felt my pulse in my throat. Somehow the forest had integrated the devices. The microphones we'd left had become part of it. Night came quickly, dragging a cold mist with it. I built a small fire, its glow trembling against the towering trunks. Each tree seemed to lean closer, drawn by the light or by me. I couldn't tell which. I studied the bark under the flames' flicker, and that's when I saw them. Faint concentric patterns in the wood, not random but deliberate. The growth rings formed faces, dozens of them. Some clear, some warped, like portraits drawn from memory. I recognized one, the sharp brow of Dr. Keene, my mentor who'd vanished during the first survey. Another looked like me. A rational mind resists magic, but this didn't feel supernatural. It felt biological, evolutionary. What if the forest wasn't simply alive, but recording? What if every sound, every vibration, every word spoken within it was etched into its body? Trees are natural resonators. Their fibers carry frequencies for centuries. It wasn't just a poetic idea, it was physics. Bioacoustic memory. I ran a soil test by firelight using my pocket analyzer. The screen blinked with trace metals, copper, iron, and a polymer found only in digital recording tape. My breath caught. The forest wasn't metaphor anymore. It was a literal archive. The wind shifted again, carrying whispers that seemed to originate from the trees themselves. I leaned forward, heart pounding. Through the branches came a voice, soft, fractured, familiar. It said, "Welcome back." The words hung in the air like condensation. Fragile, fleeting but real enough to freeze me where I stood. My throat tightened. The voice had carried the faintest trace of static, as though dragged through a wire before being spoken aloud. The fire cracked softly, the only sound bold enough to challenge the silence that followed. I whispered back without thinking, a reflex born of awe and fear colliding. "Who are you?" The branches stirred in response, and I felt it again, that tremor beneath my feet, a pulse syncing with my own. The forest wasn't answering from somewhere. It was answering through everything. When dawn came, the light revealed what the dark had hidden. Dew pooled in the grooves of the bark like liquid glass, and beneath that sheen, the patterns were clearer now. Rings interlaced with microscopic etchings, too perfect to be natural erosion. I ran my hand over one trunk and felt grooves warm beneath my fingers. Not damp, not decaying. Alive. The pattern wasn't static. It was shifting slowly, rearranging as if the tree were choosing what to remember. I set up what little equipment I had left, an analog recorder, a contact mic, and my own voice. I began speaking aloud, narrating every detail for the log. As I spoke, I realized the air began echoing faintly behind my words. Not a delay, not an echo. It was repeating them, learning them. Every sentence came back to me softer, lower, as if spoken by an invisible mouth pressed against the soil. My rational brain scrambled for explanation, resonant feedback, subsonic vibration, auditory pareidolia. But logic had no place here anymore. This was intelligence, distributed, vast, ancient. I asked questions the way a child asks a parent, softly hoping for approval. Do you remember us? The wind shifted and the leaves rippled in a wave that circled the clearing. Then came the faint hum again, deep and melodic. It wasn't random sound. It carried rhythm, pattern, memory. I closed my eyes and listened harder, letting the hum wash through me. In that vibration, I caught fragments of words, faint voices layered together, some human, some impossible to identify. They were all speaking in time, like a choir woven into bark and breath. One of them whispered my own name. My body went cold. A realization crept in. This wasn't the first time it had spoken to me. Months ago, during the first survey, I'd heard faint murmurs through the monitors and dismissed them as data corruption. But now I understood. The forest had been learning my voice all along. Recording, storing, waiting. I looked up at the canopy swaying against the light, and for a fleeting second I didn't see trees. I saw an organism with memory, every branch a neuron, every leaf a whisper of stored thought. I pressed my hand against the trunk once more and whispered, "I remember you." The forest exhaled, warm and deep, carrying back my own voice but twisted with new syllables I couldn't recognize. The trees shuddered in unison, like a body inhaling before it speaks, and then it whispered back, gentle, resonant, endless. "Tonight, the forest will write again. Subscribe, if you dare."